We made mention that Isaiah begins to bring judgment against, or prophesy judgment against the nations that are surrounding the southern tribes of Judah. And he started out by pronouncing judgment upon Babylon. And then as we get into our study tonight, he will begin to pronounce judgment upon Moab. But before we do, let's get into just a moment of prayer and ask God's blessings before we look at these scriptures tonight. Father, we ask that you would bless, that you would minister to our hearts, give us understanding. And Jesus, we just ask for the Spirit's direction tonight upon the Word, that He would just do His work in us and for us as we study the Scriptures this evening. We thank you for the accuracy of your Word. We thank you that, Lord, we can trust in it, rely on it, and know that it is true because you've kept every word, and you will keep every word. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Well, it starts off the burden of Moab. Now, Moab, if you have an atlas in your Bible, is directly across the Dead Sea. It is what we call today Jordan today. Actually, there's two kingdoms of the Old Testament that makes up the country of Jordan today, and that is the people of Moab, and then above them, north of them, would be the children of Ammon. Now, they're brothers, and you remember in the book of Genesis, we're told how they got started. They are the result of an incestual relationship between Lot, the nephew of Abraham, with his two daughters. You remember when they fled Sodom and Gomorrah, they fled to Zoar, and as they came to Zoar, he fled out into a cave and thought that they were the only ones, the daughters did, thought they were the only ones left on the planet Earth. They said, we can't be childless, so let's get Dad drunk, and then I'll spend the night with him tonight, and then tomorrow night we'll do the same thing, and you, the younger sister, will take him and lay with him. And they both had children. The oldest sister bore Moab, and where we have the Moabites, and then the youngest sister had the children or the offspring of Ammon. And so they were a constant problem with the people of Israel until the days of David. David finally took care of them. His great-grandmother was a Moabite, and Ruth of Naomi, you remember. But traditions say that the Moabites killed David's parents in the latter days. And we don't know, but we know that David dealt very harshly with the Moabites when he, in 2 Samuel, dealt with his external enemies. That is, when he went out and he fought the Syrians, the Ammonites, the Moabites, and the Edomites, and the Philistines, he dealt very severely with the Moabites, and he only left 1/3 of them alive after he got done with them, and he took those third and put them in service to the temple. And tonight, as we'll look into the scriptures, it is even bringing that issue back up, that they are to return back to the service of the Lord and things like that. So we'll see as we go through here. But what's going on? The burden of Moab. The burden, you remember last week we mentioned it means judgment. The judgment of Moab. And it says because, tells us right up front why the judgment is coming. Because in the night of Ar of Moab, now these are the cities of Moab, and what's happening is that the Assyrians are coming through. As the Assyrians came through or was heading to destroy the Edomites, which are south of them, they came through the area of Moab. And this is the trail that is, as they came through Moab, wanting to destroy the Edomites, they came with total destruction upon the towns, the cities, the life of the Moabites. And they just laid waste the cities. And so this is a prophecy concerning the destruction of Moab, 2 years before it ever is going to happen. So this prophecy happens 2 years before the destruction of Moab. It was given, we believe, around the year 704 BC. And so here it says the burden of Moab, because in the night, and that is when the city Ar was destroyed in the night. It was a night siege, and it was laid waste and brought to silence, because in the night Kir of Moab, which was another city that was besieged by the Assyrians in the evening or the late night times, in laid waste and brought to silence. He has gone up to Bayet, or whatever these names. Wish they were Los Angeles and Seattle, and to Dibon and the high places to weep. Moab shall wail over Nebo. Now Nebo is the mountain right, if you were standing in Jericho, if you're looking at Jericho and you kind of look east of Jericho, across the Jordan Valley and up the mountains of Moab, there was be a mountain peak just basically north, the north tip of the Dead Sea. You would see Nebo. Now, what is so fantastic about Nebo? Well, that's where Moses was taken by God, you remember, and allowed to look into the promised land. Wasn't allowed to go into the promised land, but he was there on top of Mount Nebo, and he got to take a look at, and on a clear day from Mount Nebo, you can see the Great Sea. That is the Mediterranean Sea. You can actually see the whole land of Israel from that vantage point. It's beautiful. We were fortunate enough to, a few years back, to stand up on Mount Nebo and see just what Moses saw. And hopefully next year, if the Lord wills, that we can go back to Israel, we'll go to Mount Nebo and into Jordan and see these things. But it's also where God took Elijah up. You remember, he was heading for Mount Nebo. It is where God took Moses and buried him from that point, and possibly the dispute over the body of Moses that Jude talks about between Michael and Satan. And so it's an interesting place. It's a special place. But here it says that there's going to be wails, and Moab shall wail over Nebo, the destruction of it, and Deba, on all their heads shall be baldness, so they'll look like me a little bit, and every beard cut off. Now, what is he talking about? Well, when, and in the Eastern culture, when there's great mourning, when there's great affliction, they show it by afflicting their bodies at sometimes, shaving their heads. Putting on sackcloth, as we'll read here in verse 3. And in sackcloth, in their streets they shall gird themselves with sackcloth. That is, that there's going to be great mourning and there's going to be great grief. And they would cut their hair off. Now, usually what they would do is they would cut their hair off, let it grow for a while, and then they would shave off their hair again after it's grown out a little bit. And then they would shave their heads again in their mourning, and then they would burn their hair on the altar and for their pagan gods. But they would, as an offering, and that would end their grief, their sorrow. But here they have this great baldness, and their beards would be cut off. All their hair, facial hair, they would cut off. And in the streets, they will wear sackcloth. Now, sackcloth was thought to be an animal skin, much probably like a camel skin, but turned inside out. You wouldn't wear the smooth side against your body. You would turn it inside out, and you would wear the hairy part against your skin. Now, that is a horrible feeling. If you've ever pet a camel and just touched one, you realize walking around all day in that kind of clothes, that would be affliction. It would be mourning. It would help you cry. And so here, this clothes that they would wear, typifying their affliction. On the top of their houses and in their streets, everyone shall wail, weeping abundantly. Great mourning throughout the land. And Heshbon shall cry out, and Elith, their voice shall be heard, even unto Jahaz. This is 30 miles away from these cities. And and they're hearing each other cry. The cry is so loud. Therefore the armed soldiers of Moab shall cry out, that is, that they'll cry out in fear. His life shall be grievous unto him. They'll wish that they weren't even alive. My heart shall cry out for Moab. His fugitives or refugees shall flee unto Zor, to this place. And for by the ascent of another place, with weeping shall they go up from in the way of another place. They shall rise up and cry of destruction. So there's just going to be mass hysteria, crying, weeping, gnashing of teeth, basically. And and so they're going to be basically howling, as it says back in verse 8. They're going to be wailing, cries, howling. It's just great destruction is going to be laid upon Moab. Now, God's prophesied this 2 years before it is going to happen. Matter of fact, in verse 6 of chapter 16, it tells us that they are still in their great pride. Moab is prospering. They think they've broken their yoke from Judah. They have ran away from their responsibility and their bondage to Judah, serving them, paying tribute to them, having to answer to them. And they're prospering, and they think they've gotten away with their sin. And God says 2 years before it ever falls apart on them, that this is going to happen to them. And so he says, send ye the lambs to the ruler of the land of Selah, to the wilderness, unto the mount of the daughters of Zion. And so in chapter 16, in verse 1, is a call now back to them to provide the lambs that they were supposed to provide for the temple. That they were to bring the lambs from the land of land from Selah, which is Petra. And Selah in the scriptures is another name for Petra. And he says to the wilderness, unto the mount of the daughters of Zion. So get back into in order here. Submit yourself once again. Yield yourself. Start sending your tribute of lambs back to Zion. For it shall be that like a wandering bird cast out of the nest, so the daughters of Moab shall be at the fords of Arnon. Now, Arnon is a river that flows about right into the middle of the Dead Sea from the Jordan side. And so he says, you're going to be wandering. He says, take counsel, execute judgment, make thy shadow as the night in the midst of the noonday. Hide the outcast, betray not him that wandereth. Now, he's talking to them about something that is going to happen to them in the very short future. But in the next verse, in verse 4, he jumps from the present time, their close proximity of future time, into a whole nother era, into a whole different age. And he comes and he starts off and he says, let my outcast dwell with thee, Moab. Now he changes the whole thing. What's he referring to? Well, we'll read in just a second. But what is he referring to is a time where, well, let's go over to Matthew chapter 24. And let's take a look at it. Matthew chapter 24. You remember on the night that Jesus Christ was betrayed into the hands of men, as they were heading towards the Garden of Gethsemane, the disciples that were with him were curious about, he was been telling them that he was going to leave them and that he was going to send another comforter, and that if they loved him, they would keep his commandments, and the John chapter 14, 15, 16. And it was about this time as they left that room from their singing, from the Passover supper, they were heading towards the garden, and they asked the Lord this question: what are the signs of your coming? When shall the end be? They asked him several questions. How do we know that you're coming? What are the signs of your coming? And Jesus said this in his discourse. Around verse 15, he says, when you therefore shall see the abomination of the desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, and whosoever readeth, let him understand. Then let them who are in Judea flee into the mountains. Now, the only mountains around Judea are the mountains of Moab. There's not much there. They're just hills around Judah. But if you get into the mountains, you get into the mountains of Moab. And let him who is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him who is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto those who are with child, and to those who are nursing children in those days. But pray that your flight be not in winter, neither on the Sabbath day. So he says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel. Let's go over to Daniel chapter 9, and we'll see what he's speaking about. Daniel chapter 9. Daniel is concerned. He sees, as he's been reading his Bible, that the time of their bondage in Babylon is about up. He realizes that the 70 years that God had prophesied through the prophet Daniel has almost come to pass. And Daniel begins to be curious, what's going to happen to Israel? And he begins to pray in Daniel chapter 9 about the sins of the people of Israel, begin to confess them to God. And he begins to make intercession for the people of Israel. And as he is praying there, an angel appears. the angel Gabriel. And Gabriel tells him, Daniel, you're greatly beloved by God. And your prayers have come up before him, and God wants to tell you what is going to happen with the people of Israel. There is, excuse me, there is 490 years left on the calendar for the nation of Israel. And he says at the going forth of the commandment to restore and to rebuild the temple and the streets of Jerusalem and the walls. He says from that commandment to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, he says it is going to be 483 years before the Messiah shows up. To that day. And so and then he says, and in the middle of that week that the Messiah shows up, he's going to be cut off. But then, as we'll read here in Daniel chapter 9, in verse 26, he says, and after 80 and 2 years, or 483, shall the Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. Notice, it's not for himself, but it's for us. He says, in 173,880 days from the time the commandment goes forth to restore and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, he says 173,880 days, the Messiah is going to come in to Jerusalem. He says, when that happens, the Messiah is going to be cut off that time, in that week. But not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end of it shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war of desolations are determined. And he, now this is different, this is not referring to Jesus Christ. But it says that he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice of the oblation. I'll get that one. I've done that before, haven't I? Oh, boy. Now I'm turning all red. To cease, and for the overspreading of the abomination, he shall make it desolate, even until the... Oh, well, I'll tell you anyway. Lord, take me home now. It'll be a good time. God is going, in the middle of that week, the Messiah will be cut off. That will leave 1 week's time left, or a 7-year period of time left. What will happen then, that we know, in Daniel chapter 12, there is going to come a man that is going to make covenant with the children of Israel. I believe prophetically it will happen sometime after the events that we see prophesied in Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39. The war between Persia and the area of what we know, the former Soviet Union, along with Libya, Ethiopia. And they're going to come up and come against the children of Israel and destroy, or try to seek to destroy Israel. And when that happens, sometime after that, there is going to come a man that is going to rise up and make peace between Israel and the rest of the world. In that peace treaty, there is going to be the ability for them to begin their worship services over again. The ability to start sacrificing once again. See, today the Jewish nation cannot take care of their sins adequately as far as they're concerned because they can't sacrifice. They can only hope that God will judge on a curb when they, in a sense, because of their good deeds outweighing their bad deeds. And so that's how they are sacrificing today. But they know in their hearts that the only way they can actually deal with their sins adequately according to the Scriptures is to sacrifice, and they will do that. And that is one of the things that they're crying for today in Israel, is the right to have their temple and the right to begin their sacrifices. There's a group called the Temple Mount Faithful with Gershon Solomon, not the Gershon that you met Sunday. He's not that radical. But Gershon Solomon, we've been able to meet him, and he is a fantastic man. But he has dedicated his life to basically blow up the Temple Mount, in a sense, the Dome of the Rock, so that the temple can be built. Now, many of us feel as though, like Professor Kaufman has been able to distinguish where the Temple Mount actually sits, and that is a little bit, about 150 feet northwest of the Dome of the Rock, called the Dome of the Spirit, or the Dome of Tablets. The Muslims call that the Dome of Tablets because they believe that is exactly where the temple stood, where the Holy of Holies was. And they've erected this dome over this place, saying this is the Dome of the Tablets, where the Ten Commandments resided in the Ark of the Covenant. It would be interesting because in the book of Revelation, it says in Revelation chapter 11, as God is measuring out, or John is measuring out the temple on the Temple Mount during the tribulation period. John says, God gave me a reed, almost like a rod, which is about 10 feet long. And he says, go out and measure it. And he says, now, don't measure the outer walls, because that is given to the profane, to the heathen. God says, don't measure the outside, because that is given. If you laid out the temple measurements and you would forget the outside of the temple, you would realize that the Dome of the Rock could sit where it sits, and the temple could sit in its right location, and none of them would be bothered. I believe some way, somehow, the Antichrist is going to be able to get both sides to agree with that and live with that. But we're told that in the middle of that agreement, that middle of the week, 3.5 years into it, or 1,260 days. They go on a Babylonian calendar, which is a 360-day year. 1,260 days into it, or 42 months, what is going to happen is that the Antichrist is going to come in, and he is going to set up an image, and he's going to declare himself to be God and demand that people worship him as God. Now, we talked about this a little bit last week in Isaiah chapter 14. But here, Jesus said, now that that scene, the Antichrist breaking the covenant, going in there, polluting the temple, as demanding himself to be worshipped at God, setting up an image in the temple of himself or of the beast, demanding to be worshipped as God. That is what Daniel calls the abomination of desolation. That's what Jesus referred to in Matthew chapter 24. When you see the abomination of desolation, he says, if you're on your housetop, don't even stop for a jacket. Run to the wilderness. Run to the mountains. And if you're in your field, don't go back for anything. Just start running. Now, Zechariah chapter 13 tells us also in Revelation chapter 12, that when this happens, when this scene happens, what will happen is that Satan at that moment is thrown or cast down to the earth, and he sees that he has only a short time, 3.5 years left. And what he will do at that point will mount a full-scale attack against the nation of Israel. And he will seek to kill every Jew he can during the tribulation period. Zechariah 13 tells us that as he comes out in a flood, as it does in Revelation chapter 12, as he comes out in a flood against them, he overtakes 2/3 of them. But then 1/3 flees to the wilderness, into the mountains, and they're hid in a place that God's prepared for them. And that place is called Petra. And they are going to be sealed there, the scripture says, for 3.5 years, the last 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation period. Now go back to Isaiah chapter 16 and listen to what he says in verse 4. Let my outcasts dwell with thee, Moab. Those that have been kicked out, those that are running, those that are fugitives and refugees, let them dwell with you, Moab. Where at? In Selah. Be thou a convert to them from the face of the spoiler. The spoiler is none other than Satan or the Antichrist, who will be possessed by him. And for the extortioner is at an end. That is another name for the Antichrist, the extortioner, and is at an end. Notice he has only got 3.5 years left, and he's going to be at his end. The spoiler ceases, the oppressors are consumed out of the land. Now notice this. This is what I like. And in mercy shall the throne be established, and he shall sit upon it in truth in the tabernacle of David, judging and seeking justice and swiftly executing righteousness. All of a sudden in verse 5 you begin to see, why is he going to be exterminated? Why is he going to be ceasing? Why is all this going to happen? Because Jesus Christ comes back at the end. And it tells us, as later on we'll read later on, how he comes up from Bozrah, which is right above Petra. And he starts from there, because the armies of the Antichrist are from that point up, all the way up 120 miles up to Mount Carmel, as it says in the book of Revelation. And it says that he comes and he returns and he destroys the armies of the world. And he sets and establishes his throne. It says here, we have heard of the pride of Moab. He is very proud, even his haughtiness and his pride and his wrath. But his lies shall not be so. Therefore shall Moab wail for Moab. Every one shall wail. And the foundations of Korah shall be mount. Surely they are stricken. For the fields of Heshbon languish, and the fields are the vines of Sibmah, and the lords of the nations have broken down the principal plants of it that are come up even unto Jazer, and wanders through the wilderness. Her branches are stretched out. They are gone out over the sea, that is, over the Dead Sea. Therefore, I will bewail them. Now notice this. I will bewail with weeping of Jazer and over the vines. This is Isaiah weeping. Isaiah's weeping over. Notice this. He's not rejoicing over the destruction of his enemy, but he's actually weeping over them. He doesn't want to see it happen to him. What love, that he shows here. He says, I'm going to bewail them. I'm not going to be saying, yeah, get him, God, destroy him, beat him harder, and things like that. Because what happens is Isaiah is watching this. Because Assyria doesn't touch them or doesn't destroy Judah yet. It won't happen for another 100 years. Judah won't be destroyed. There'll be many cities in Judah that will be taken, but the people themselves won't be destroyed by Assyria themselves. So Isaiah is saying, I'm going to be grieving over this. And gladness in verse 10 is taken away, and joy out of the plentiful field. And in the vineyard shall be no more singing, neither shall there be shouting. He says, I won't. There's no more singing. And basically, what he's describing is the joy that is in the vineyard. When the grapes are harvested, and they put them in the wine vats, and they begin to stamp out the grapes, they would sing. There'd be much singing as they're stomping on the grapes. And that's how they would do that. That's how they made wine back then, is that they get in the big old vat and they start stomping on them. Hope the guy had clean feet before he started, but he'd start stomping, and they would start singing as they would start mushing the grape juice down into the funnel, and it would pour out into the vats. And so that he says, there's no singing in the wine presses, or he says the vintage shouting is going to cease in verse 10. Wherefore my heart shall sound like a harp for Moab. My heart, or my bowels, my whole being is going to be upset. It's just going to be crying for them. It says that it shall come to pass when it is seen that Moab is weary on the high places, and he shall come to his sanctuary to pray, but he shall not prevail. Their gods won't help them, is what he's saying here. Their gods will not be able to help them. They'll try their best, and they'll even go to their gods, but they won't be heard. This is the word that the Lord has spoken concerning Moab since that time. Now, what that means is that he already prophesied this once before, but now he's saying it again. But now, it says in verse 14, the Lord has spoken, saying, within 3 years, as the years of a hireling, the Lord of glory shall be despised, and the glory of Moab shall be dispersed, with all the great multitude, and the remnant shall be very small and feeble. That is, that there will be barely anybody there. And then he says, as the year of a hireling. That is, and that's very interesting, because God says, in 3 years, as the year of a hireling, it shall come to pass. What is he saying? He's giving an exact time. The year of a hireling is this. When you are a hireling, when you become a slave for X amount of days, you wouldn't say, well, let's say I become a slave and I have to work for the next 3 years. So I would say, well, sometime in the year 2000, for I'm going to be free. No, I would say to you on, what's the date? On March, what is that? I got to look at my, March 8th. On March 8th, 2004, I'm going to be free. That's how a hireling would tell you. They would know exactly the day that they're free. You know? And so God is saying, as the years of the hireling is, in 3 years, that is, you can mark it from this day forward that I gave you this prophecy, it is going to take place. And it did. Well, the burden of Damascus. We got plenty of time. The burden of Damascus, which is Syria now. Now we go way up north, above the northern tribes of Israel. And he says, behold, Damascus is taken away. Now, this prophecy and this happening took place some 30 years before Moab was taken away. So note something, that the prophecies that you're reading are not in chronological order. But he's going back and forth. Isaiah's going back and forth. But he's giving us the judgment or the prophecy against Damascus of Syria. And this takes place 30 years prior to the one that is going to take place in 3 years. And he says, Damascus is taken away from being a city, and it shall be a ruinous heap. The cities of Arnon are forsaken. They shall be for flocks. They shall lie down, and there shall be none that shall be afraid. That is literally, the place is going to be such a wasteland. All it is going to be used for is a place to graze sheep. And he says, the fortress also shall cease from Ephraim. Now notice this. He adds Ephraim, which is the northern tribes. They're going to be taken. Your allies, Syria, your allies are going to be taken along with you. And that's exactly what happened. In the year, I think it was the year 722 or something like right around that time, Syria came in and took not only, Assyria came in and took Syria as well as the northern tribes of Israel. And they came in. The fortresses also shall cease from Ephraim, and the kingdoms from Damascus, and the remnant of Syria. They shall be like the glory of the children of Israel, saith the Lord of hosts. Notice this. He says, Damascus, you're going to be like the glory of the nation of Israel, the northern tribes. Now, you remember what happened on a special time when before David was a king? There was a battle between the Philistines and the children of Israel. And Eli was the priest at that time in Shiloh, and he had 2 sons that were wicked sons, ripping off the people, sleeping with prostitutes. I mean, they were horrible. And people just didn't want to come to worship God anymore because they knew they were going to get their pockets picked by these guys. And so God used Samuel to bring the news to Eli that his sons were going to be killed. But they came up to a battle at that time, and the sons of Eli got this idea, hey, let's take the ark into battle. You remember that? And let's take it into battle. So they brought the ark into the battle, and they started yelling, yay, and all that. And the Philistines says, oh my gosh, they brought God into the fight. This ain't going to be a fair fight. But they encouraged themselves, the Philistines did, and said, God's in there with him, but, let's fight like men and let's do our best. And what happened? They destroyed the armies of Israel. and they captured the Ark of the Covenant. And they took it to Gath, and they took it to, to Ashkelon and Ashdod and all that, Gera and all these places. And they took it to the 5 cities of the Philistines. And you remember what happened. They all broke out in hemorrhoids and things like that. And they really had a painful time with dealing with that thing. And they sent it back. And it comes back, on a cart and all that in Beth-Shemesh and stuff like this. Well, remember the news when it came to Eli, what had happened? Now, one of the priests, or the sons of Eli, had a daughter, or had a wife that was about ready to deliver. And she actually went into delivery of that child at the time of the news that was coming that Eli, your sons are killed, and the ark of God is captured by the Philistines. Remember what happened to Eli as he fell over backwards, broke his neck basically, and he died right on the spot. And it says that the child that was born was called Ichabod. Remember that? Which means the glory has departed. And this is the reference. God says to Damascus, he says, your glory is going to be like the glory of the children of Israel. It's going to be gone. It's going to depart, saith the Lord of hosts. In that day it shall come to pass that the glory of Jacob shall be made thin, and the fatness of the flesh shall become lean. And it shall be as when the reapers gather the grain, and reapeth the ears with his arm. And it shall be as he that gathereth ears in the valley of Rippim. Yet gleaning grapes shall be left in it, as the shaking of an olive tree, 2 or 3 berries in the top of the utmost bough, 4 or 5 in its outmost fruitful branches, saith the Lord of hosts. There's not going to be enough of you left. It's going to be like after the reapers come in and shake the trees, the olive trees and everything else. There's a few of them left. You never get everything off your tree that you glean from. There's a few left up in the high places or something like that. And if you shake them real good after a while, you might get 4 or 5 grapes or olives come down or something like that. That's all that's going to be left. There's just going to be a very few people left in your land. At that time shall a man look to his maker. Now notice this. At this time, when they've been dealt a severe blow, when it comes down so hard on them, when it's so heavy upon them, at that day shall a man look to his maker, and his eyes shall have respect to the Holy One of Israel. What got me was how much God just, again, this is the grace of God, but to what lengths do we have to go to before God gets our attention? I mean, have you ever thought about this? Have you ever been in that situation where God deals with you and deals with you and deals with you, and finally he gets a hold of you, finally gets your attention, and you look back and you go, good grief, why did it take me so long? Why did I waste so much time to get right with God? I've wasted time. I've wasted hours. I've wasted days. I've wasted weeks. I've wasted months. I've wasted years to get right with God. And you finally do. And God's so gracious to accept you back, to bring you back into fellowship, to start working through you again. It's almost like Samson. His hair begins to grow again, and God begins to answer his prayers. But yet, they said that they're finally going to get the idea. And he shall not look to the altars, the works of his hand, neither shall he respect that which his fingers have made, neither the idols or the images. That is, that he's not ever going to look to to his gods, his foreign gods again. And really, when God dealt with the nation of Israel and when God dealt with the nation of Judah about their idolatry, when they came back, when Judah came back, they never had a problem with idolatry again. Matter of fact, they gave the Romans such a bad time about their images that they would bring in, that literally Caesar began to say, look, leave the gods out of the country. It just doesn't pay to bring them into Palestine, to bring them into the nation of Israel, because they were so adamant that there is not going to be a false god in this place. And so they never did. And this is what God says: they're going to be finally broke of this idol worship and this to have images. In that day shall his strong cities be like a forsaken bough and an uttermost branches, which they left because of the children of Israel, and there shall be desolation. Because, now he says the reason why, because thou hast forgotten the God of thy salvation. This is the reason why they're being judged, because they've forgotten God, the God of their salvation, and has not been mindful of the rock of thy strength. Therefore shalt thou plant pleasant plants, and it shall set it with a strange slip. In the day shalt thou make thy plants to grow, and in the morning shalt thou make thy seed to flourish, but the harvest shall be a heap in a day of grief and dispersed sorrow. Basically, you're going to plant, but you're never going to reap. You're never going to get anything. Woe to the multitude of many people who make a noise like the noise of the sea. And he's talking about the invading army now, the Assyrians. Woe to that multitude that sounds like a mighty sea coming, and to the rushing of nations that make a rushing like the rushing of mighty waters. The nations shall rush like the rushing of many waters, but God shall rebuke them, and they shall flee far off, and shall be chased like the chaff of the mountains before the wind, and like a rolling thing before the whirlwind. I mean, they're just going to be chased away. Now notice this: and behold, at evening trouble, and before the morning he is not. That's exactly what happened to the Assyrian invading armies. They came, they stood there around the walls of Jerusalem in the evening time. They all turned in that night, and an angel of the Lord went through and killed 185,000 men in the evening. And so in the morning it rose up. It tells us in the scriptures that they rose up and they were dead. Kind of weird way to say it, but they woke up dead. How do you wake up dead? Well, they woke up dead. That's what they said. They woke up, but the people were dead. They were there in the evening time, but they weren't in the morning time. This is the portion of those who spoil us, and the lot of those who rob us. And so the prophecy of God. Now, we're going to get into chapter 18, not tonight. But next week we're going to look at chapter 18, 19, and 20. So go ahead and read those 3 chapters. And next week, chapter 20 is very short. But we want to, especially when we want to look at chapter 20 and chapter 18, because actually this is a prophecy of the dam that Egypt built several years back that has caused so much problems in the area.